see my screen. Okay. 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 Well, good morning, good evening, good day again. It's evening here, but it's still the sun hasn't quite set yet, so that's been good. Thank you so much for inviting me to this workshop. I'm really interested in the talks, and I'm interested in being able to present some of my research to you as well. I'm going to be talking about two different studies today. Both of them have to do with essentially moving beyond typical analyses of what I've seen as typical analyses of tonogenesis into a slightly different area, looking at how speech reduction can relate to patterns of tonal change in languages that already have fairly extensive tonal systems. So and we could start with that first, we could start with a typological observation, which is that lexical tone is fairly common. It's 42% of the world's languages. And I'm sure any of you who have studied with Seunghun have learned a lot about tonal systems. And one of the difficulties in looking at tonogenesis and looking at the emergence of tone in different languages is the time depth by which tone evolved in those languages. So tone is a fairly shallow time depth in certain types of language families, Athabascan, Austroasiatic, and Mayan. Reconstruction for these languages and deciding where the tones came from or how they mutated is a bit easier than for those families where tone is much older. So in Tibeto-Burman or Bantu or Oto-Mangaean languages, tone is reconstructed at a proto-level, it's a lot more difficult to see how tones have developed in those languages. But one interesting thing I think is that if you were to look at the literature, you might think that once a language evolves tones, that's it. You can wash your hands. You don't have to worry about any more sound change, because sound change must stop. But that's obviously not true. So sound change does not stop once a language develops tone, and a lot of later developments create even greater tonal complexity. So what I'm really looking at here is what types of factors contribute to greater tonal diversification and change in tone languages. Okay. All right. So, and I'll be looking at two different studies. And in each study, I'm looking at low-level phonetic variation in tone production as it relates to patterns of what I think are ongoing patterns of tonal change in the languages. These are Oto-Mangaean languages spoken in Mexico. And in the first study, I'll be looking at phonetic variation in the production of rising tones in dialect of Mixtec. This is recent work that should appear in Language and Speech, hopefully in the next year. And in this particular line of work, I'm looking at the degree to which tonal reduction can lead to patterns of phonologization. In the other study, I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm looking at morphological tone, and I'll be looking at a morphologically conditioned tone in the context of reduction of the trigger, which conditions this morphological tone. But here I'll be looking at another factor that leads to tonal diversification, and that is how a reliance on contextual tonal cues can lead, might influence the loss of a triggering morpheme. And so the robustness of those contextual cues might lead to a more reduction of the trigger. But what I think is sort of common thread throughout this work is that well-known factors like speech reduction and cue reweighting end up being responsible for patterns of tonal diversification. And so we'll dig into how those things work. So in the first study, I'm looking at tonal reduction, and I take it as a general pattern within phonetics and in speech production that speech reduction is ubiquitous, and it's actually one of the factors that leads to phonologization. So when speech is reduced in a particular way, that may be heard by listeners and then reconceptualized as part of those listeners' phonological underlying representations, let's say, for a particular contrast. And this doesn't just occur in segmental phonology, even though it's been examined much more there. It occurs also for tonal systems. So one of the types of ways that people have talked about tonal reduction is via a pattern of tonal undershoot. And if you're familiar with vowel undershoot in relation to vowel production, tonal undershoot is something rather similar. When there is insufficient time to produce a target F0 height or a target movement, let's say for a particular tone, it might be undershot. It might be produced in a variant way that makes it look rather different. And there's also temporal constraints on the production of tones. So rising tones require larger temporal windows than falling tones or level tones. So it might be the case that given this pattern of tonal undershoot, that it influences things like rising tones more than other types of tones. And so to give you an example, this is just a figure from some recent work by Chung and Chu from 2015. And in this study, they were looking at how different tones are produced at different speech rates. And what you're seeing here is a pitch track of a rising tone on the left panel and a low tone on the right panel. And the preceding tone varies. It's either a low or a high tone, okay, in Taiwanese Mandarin. And so one thing you might observe is that the curves down at the bottom of the left panel all look like they still are rising tones. And this is essentially the transition between a low tone and a rising tone and back to a low tone. But if the preceding tone is a high tone and it happens to be produced, the sequence of 3 different tones is produced rather quickly, you get the patterns that you see up top here, the dash dot pattern and the red pattern. And this is an underlying rising tone in Taiwanese Mandarin. So what we observe here is a pattern of tonal undershoot. The rise is not realized as a rise. In fact, it undergoes tonal leveling as a type of phonetic pattern. Okay, so that's what I mean by tonal undershoot. Okay, there's a number of things that can trigger tonal undershoot. Speech rate. So if you don't have as much time because you're speaking quickly, you might reduce particular tones and not produce the contours that would be produced in otherwise careful production. Phrase position can influence tone production. So tones might be reduced in non-phrase final position, but be produced faithfully, let's say in phrase final position, or produced in a sort of canonical way in that position. You might also have conflicting tonal environments. So as we just saw on the preceding slide, if we have a high tone preceding, let's say a low tone preceding a rise and a high tone following that rise, we can think of the rise as interpolating between the low and the high that are adjacent to that tone. But if we have, let's say the opposite, a high tone before a rise and a low tone after the rise, that rising tone is in a context where it has to essentially make a very quick transition between the other targets, and you might end up with undershoot in that context. The other condition here is information structure. So in de-accented or defocused nouns that carry a particular tone, you might get tonal undershoot as a function of information structure. So in the first experiment, what I'm looking at in the first experiment is the influence of phrase position on tone production. And there's been some research on how tones are influenced by phrase position. A lot of this research has taken place in African languages. So, and there's an interesting relationship between lexical tone, phonological tones, and how they might be realized in different prosodic positions. So for instance, many people studying phonetics and phonology are probably familiar with the fact that in many languages, there's a final declination in declarative utterances. That occurs in tone languages as well, but it can be mediated by lexical tones. So in some languages like Kipare or Moro or Mbosi, you have lowering of all tones at phrase final position. But in other languages like Mambila or Taiwanese or Akan, only the low tones or the falling tones undergo this lowering in phrase final position. And so this is what I mean by this relationship between the phonological tones and the prosodic boundaries. Some prosodic boundaries can influence tones in a tone-specific way. And so what I'm looking at in this study is how tones change at prosodic boundaries, and the follow-up question, where does tonal hyperarticulation and hypoarticulation occur? So the language of study here is Yolo-Xochitl Mixtec. It's spoken in Guerrero, Mexico. There are about 4,000 speakers. I've done fieldwork on this language since 2010. And it's spoken here in, here's the lower elbow of Mexico. So the border of Mexico and Guatemala is to your right. And you see the red dot here where Yolo-Xochitl is located in the eastern portion of Guerrero. Okay. A little bit about the language. So roots are minimally bimoraic. Moraic structure is extremely important in Mixtec. And as I'm speaking to an audience of many Japanese speakers, they probably are familiar with this concept. So roots are minimally bimoraic. You either have to have a root that is a long vowel that's monosyllabic, or two short vowels that is disyllabic. Glottalization is also contrastive. It's indicated here with a glottal stop, if people can see my cursor, in between vowels. It's independent from tone. And final syllables are prominent. And we'll see some evidence for this prominence in the phonetics that I'm going to show you. Excuse me. But we also have phonological restrictions on the basis of syllable position. So nasal vowels only occur in stem final syllables. There's fewer vowel contrasts in non-final syllables. 9 different tones occur in stem final syllables, but only 5 on non-final syllables, and so on. I think that there's what I would say reasonably good evidence to say that final syllables have some sort of special status in the language. Whether you want to call that stress or prominence is a separate question. Okay. There are a number of tones in the language. So in disyllabic words, disyllabic roots, or words, I should say, there are 26 tonal melodies that are possible. There are 20 on monosyllables. And one of the reasons why people that work on Mixtec often think about the language in terms of moraic structure is that the tonal system seems to really be linked to moras. So we have 5 tones that can occur on the initial mora of a root and 9 on the following mora. And if we, you can have a number that can contrast on a monosyllabic word. And, you know, if we were to say that tone was associated with syllables, we'd have to say, well, there's 20 tones in the language. I think it makes a lot more sense to say that there's up to 9 tones, but there's certain tones that can occur on a penultimate mora and ones that can occur on a final mora. So, and what you might see here from the figure, in addition to having this large number of minimal, you know, a minimal 19 word minimal set, it's what, and dea, like, what is it? This, there's a term for it anyways. But you can see that there's some morphology here too. There's negation, there's first person singular marking, and so on. There's also aspect marking that is all marked by tone in addition to it having a lexical load. So older impressionistic studies on related languages have suggested that tone is sensitive to word and phrasal position. These are all older observations that people have made, but prior to the work that I've done with colleagues on Mixtec and a couple other exceptions, there's not much on actually investigating whether tone is influenced by phrase position. There's a little bit of an initial assumption we might make, that is that in a more complex tone system like we see here, one anticipates less sensitivity of tone to phrasal position than one might anticipate for a less complex tone system. So in the first study, we looked at 20 tonal melodies in disyllabic words in non-final contexts, that is before a prepositional phrase and before an adverb. And we also looked at utterance final contexts. So we had sentences like shashiran dishi, he is eating corn, and shashiran dishi bitin, he's eating corn right now. And essentially the only thing that's different here is that one has an adverb at the end. So in the one context, the target word in dishi for corn is phrase final. In the other context, it's not phrase final. Okay. And we recorded a number of words for these conditions and repetitions with 9 speakers. We extracted F0 trajectories that we normalized and converted to log normal values. We also extracted duration values. Okay. So there's a number of tonal melodies that we examined here. I'm not going to be able to go into a lot of detail for all of them because there's just so many melodies, but you'll see essentially a recurrent pattern throughout them. But first I want to talk about duration. So and as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there is final stress in the language, so root final stress. And so I'm going to orient you towards looking at these figures here. On the left, we have onset duration, that is just consonant duration in the onset position for penultimate syllables and final syllables in the same word. In utterance non-final position and in utterance final position. Okay, so we're looking at 2 factors here, both syllable position as well as utterance position. And what you can see here is in the left panels is that onsets in final syllables are longer than onsets in non-final syllables, and they're lengthened a little bit when they are in utterance final position. When we look at vowel duration on the right, the same organization of the plots here, we see that essentially the vowels when the word occurs in non-phrase final position are about the same duration. But when the word appears in utterance final position, we get utterance final lengthening of that final vowel. So that's the observation right here in the rightmost panel. Okay. And if we jump to looking at the tones, I have to reorient you again because there's a lot of things going on here. What you're looking at here is, again, disyllabic words. And these are disyllabic words with the 3 level tonal melodies. So that's a sequence of 2 levels. And when these tones are produced across the word in utterance non-final position, that's a solid line. We see here's tone 4/4, that's a high-high. The green is 3/3, it's like a mid-mid tone, and the red is 1/1. It's like a low-low tone, or sort of, it always falls a little bit. But what we notice here is that in phrase final position, the highest tone raises and the lowest tone lowers. And that's going to be a consistent pattern that we observe in the other data. So let's jump to some of the other melodies. So on the left here, like I said, there's a lot of melodies. What we see is these 2 observations at the bottom, we get lowering of the melodies that involve some sort of fall across the word. So a melody 3/2 and a melody 4/1 fall are significantly lower than they are in non-phrase final position. And conversely, melodies that rise, where the final tone is that high tone, the tone 4, we observe final raising. So this is identical to what we just saw with the level tone melodies. We're getting essentially, if the word ends with the highest tone, it raises. If it ends with the lowest tone, it lowers. Okay. And the last tonal panel here is showing words that have a final falling tone. So we have sequences of a level tone on the penult, followed by a falling tone on the final syllable. And what you'll notice here is that all these falling tones fall in phrase final position, but they don't fall as much in non-phrase final position. So this is just like the pattern that we observed, the pattern that was observed for certain African languages, for instance. But take a look at what's happening on the right. So here what we have is a preceding tone 4 on the penultimate syllable. Can people see my cursor? Seunghun, give me a thumbs up. Can you see my cursor? You can see my cursor. Okay, good. All right, so on this penultimate syllable, we have level tone 4. And then in the final syllable, in utterance final position, we have the dotted line. Here are our rising tones, but the solid lines are also the rising tones. So what's happening here? Why are the rising tones so different? What's happening? And how does this relate to sound change? So one way to think about the durational differences observed in the MESTEC data is to take a look at the degree to which we're getting durational compression in non-phrase final position relative to final position. So in other words, how much shorter are those vowels in non-phrase final position than in final position? So we can look at contraction rather than expansion, rather than the sort of lengthening, we're looking at compression. And what we observe here is that rising tones, in particular, if you look at my cursor, the 413 is right here, and the 424 is right here. These two rising tones that we just observed on the preceding slide are reduced to less than 40% of their duration in final position. So really, the final lengthening is long, but we could also say that, you know, the compression within an utterance is fairly strong. There's a strong pattern of hypoarticulation. Okay. And if we dig into the data, and let's take a look at that final low to mid rise. It's a tone 1-3. In fact, for 3 of the 9 speakers, this tone was realized on average too short to be analyzed. It was under 50 milliseconds on average. These are very quick productions by the speakers. For 6 of the 9 speakers, this tone was consistently leveled in non-final position. So that's the pattern that we observed in the preceding slide. And I'll go back there briefly just to show you, this is that red line where that 1-3 tone is rather than a rise, it's a fall. So that pattern is observed for all the speakers, but interestingly, for 3 of these 6 speakers, it's also leveled in final position. So take a look at the panels up here. This is divided up by speaker now. And the solid line here is that low to mid rise in non-final position. And the dotted line is that same tone in final position. And what you see on the upper panels here for these 3 speakers, ACG, CTB, and CTC, is that that final tone is leveled regardless of where it occurs, even if speakers have a substantial amount of time to produce the tone at utterance final position. And that's not as true for some of the other speakers down at the bottom here. And then if we jump to tone 2-4, this is the sort of low to high rise. We get the pattern for all speakers where there's leveling in non-final position of this tone. But it seems like in final position, this is still realized as a rise for most speakers. Some speakers have some leveling, so speakers CTB is a little bit level here, but for most speakers, it's a rising tone when it is in utterance final position. So this appears to be some sort of emerging allotony rule where that low to high rise is realized as a little bit more of something like a mid-tone before some other tone. Okay. Is this tonal change in progress? We're looking at running speech. We're looking at tones realized in different positions. You know, I've gone back and forth with this. It's possibly tonal change in progress. One interesting thing is that there's a related dialect of MESTEC spoken nearby where a low to mid rise has merged, essentially created an additional 4th level tone. So Alkusauka MESTEC has a tone level 2 where Yolosochit has a 1-3 in a different position in the word. This is a different position in the word, but that same tonal pattern has occurred at least in some other MESTEC variety. So it looks very similar to the pattern we're seeing here where that 1-3 tone is leveling. So to summarize this work, vowels are lengthened in phrase final position but shortened elsewhere. And phrase final position is marked by this range expansion of tones. The highest tone raises, the lowest tones lower. And these rising tones are leveled in non-utterance final position and sometimes in utterance final position. And that's where I think the tonal change is occurring. So what's the mechanism by which this might be happening? So specifically some recent work as well, has found that processes of speech reduction may lead to sound change, and reduction is mostly conditioned by prosody. So we're looking at a prosodic context here that might be conditioning some sort of sound change. And in particular, there's this point here raised by, in Ben Perel's dissertation, that is prosodically conditioned undershoot can lead to sound change if learners misattribute the conditioned variability to phonological control instead of prosodic influence. So rather than looking at segmental patterns, what I'm finding here is that it seems that prosodically conditioned tonal undershoot might also lead to sound change. So it seems like we're getting something like that, and that's why speakers are producing this low to mid rise as a level tone, even when they have all the time in the world to realize it as a rise. So why do we get this? It's interesting, this seems to occur only with the rising tones. As I mentioned earlier, rises require more time to be realized than level or falling trajectories, and they tend to be longer in duration. But what we're observing here is a lot of durational compression, and as a result, the rising tones might be particularly susceptible to leveling when we get articulatory undershoot. So we might have a pattern whereby we have some sort of rise in non-final position that gets leveled over time and then gets essentially phonologized as some sort of level, and then we have just interpolation between a high and a mid. And that's what I think is happening with the low mid rise here. Okay, so we've looked at an example where prosody is an initiating factor in sound change and how that relates to speech reduction. But I want to turn now to a different focus, and that is that given that reduction and variation occur, speakers will rely more on these cues, more on those cues which are stable. In other words, I want to sort of jump to a different question, and that is, how does cue stability guide the selection of reduced variance? So I'm kind of flipping the table here, but we're still going to be looking at reduction. Okay, so, and I'm also going to be looking at morphophonology rather than just looking at the sort of low-level phonetic production of tone. So one thing that's true for Oto-Mangaean languages is that there are a number of personal clitics which condition tonal changes on roots. This is ubiquitous across the family. So in Ichi-Nyoso Triqui, for instance, the word for hand is ra'a, but my hand is ra'a with a higher tone and a final ha, this final breathy h. And that higher tone and that tonal change is a marker of first person singular, either possession on nouns or subject marking on verbs. And this is found for certain clitics in Triqui, but not all clitics condition tonal changes. So there's some clitics like a third person marker, various third person markers that don't do anything to the root. So it is not something that's true for all of the morphology, but certain morphemes do it. So I was interested in the question of how do the tonal changes on roots become the primary exponent for a person morpheme. And I'm going to sort of jump to the sort of reason why I picked that question, but I sort of want to talk first about this notion of stability. We can think of stability in two ways, and in fact, both ways work for my talk today. So one is as a sort of classical notion in autosegmental phonology that tones persist despite the loss of a segmental anchor. So we might lose the segmental content, but the tones persist, and they might be connected to adjacent tone-bearing units. They might end up being floating tones and so on. But there's this other notion of stability, which is cue stability. So to what extent are co-articulatory cues also stable so much that they might actually take over for the loss of segmental content? And this notion of that notion of stability, I think, ties in with this additional idea of redundancy. So when people are looking at spontaneous speech reduction, one observation is that redundant segments and redundant words, let's say certain function words, are strong predictors of the degree of durational compression and therefore the degree of speech reduction. And so what I'm looking at here is, does the redundancy of certain types of tonal changes correlate with patterns of speech reduction? How does redundancy and reduction go together? And the test case here is an interesting clitic in Triqui that undergoes varying patterns of deletion. Okay, so I'll jump ahead to what that clitic does in a minute, but I want to show you that I'm looking at a different language here, and that is Ichinyoso Triqui, spoken. The Triqui region is to the westernmost part of Oaxaca, and if that looks like it's fairly close to where we were for Mixtec, it's about an 8-hour car ride through the mountains. It's not close because you're in a very mountainous area down here in southern Mexico. But the red stars here zoomed in are the 2 villages where Ichinyoso Triqui is spoken. And it's different from Mixtec. Most morphemes are polysyllabic. That's not too different from Mixtec, but the tonal inventory and the consonant inventory are rather different. So there's 9 lexical tones that contrast on final syllables. Tone in non-final syllables is often redundant. So if we take, for example, the word for avocado, the tone on the penult there is a copy of the leftmost tone level on the final syllable. And that is a very common pattern in the language. We just have some example words here so that you can see there are 4 level tones, 4 contour tones, but these, the distribution of tones vary a little bit depending on the coda that can occur in the syllable. So there's 2 possible codas, either a glottal stop or an H, and we get 1 additional high rising tone that occurs with an H, and we get no contour tones that can occur with a final glottal stop. Okay. Final syllables are prominent as well. There's a lot of, most of the phonological contrasts occur on final syllables, very similar to Yola Sochi Mixtec. So final syllables have stress. Tone, just like Mixtec, tone is a high morphological load. It marks person, verbal aspect, and a few other distinctions. I won't go through all of the examples here, but this is just to say that there are 9 different stem allomorphs of the verb to eat, depending on the aspect of the verb, the person marking of the verb, and combinations of aspect and person marking. Okay. And when I started looking at, I've looked at Triqui morphophonology and clitic marking for a number of years since I've worked on the language. I've done field work since 2004. There are certain clitics that will condition tonal changes on the root. And then there's ones that seem to be partially segmental and also partially on the root. And the second person singular marking falls into this category. And that's because so one interesting observation here is that this clitic undergoes varying degrees of reduction. So this clitic may be realized as a full pronoun to the right, on the right edge of the noun or the verb or the adjective. The rhyme may be completely omitted, or the entire clitic might be omitted. So segmentally, it's just gone. So there's varying degrees of reduction here for the clitic. It's a morphological reduction. And separately, this clitic conditions 3 different types of changes on its host. One type of change is that roots with a final falling tone and with certain other tones undergo low tone spreading, which replaces the preceding syllable's tone. So I'll play an example of this shortly, but this is just to show you this tone 1 of the clitic spreads leftward on to the final syllable of the root. In the second class, only words that have final tone 3 raise to tone 4 before this clitic. So rather than tone 3 here, it seems like there's some sort of floating high tone that attaches to the left on the right edge of the root. And then finally, there are certain roots that never undergo any changes when you attach this clitic onto them. So there's essentially 3 different effects this clitic can have on Triqui roots. And I'm just going to play some examples here. So in 1 and 2, you're just going to hear the example of the note change on the root, And then the second example is you're getting low tone spreading. So just take a listen at these. So we have a falling tone here, but it doesn't lower this clitic here for the third person singular masculine does not lower the tone. Now listen to this. And hopefully you could hear that this nu is realized with a lower pitch. This is the low tone spreading. And now we're going to look at tone raising. So this is a nice minimal tonal pair of a root. It's a root to listen. And now, and you should hopefully hear that this nu is now raised before the same exact clitic. Okay, so we have a low tone spreading process, and we have a low tone, and we have a tone raising process. Okay, so the question I'm looking at here is, does redundant tonal information on the root predict the observed patterns of clitic reduction? And how does this relate to tonal change? So I looked at a corpus of 104 Triqui texts. These were transcribed in Elan, and this was produced by 21 different speakers as part of a documentation project. We extracted all cases of the second person singular marking, and then these were transcribed and annotated in terms of 2 degrees of reduction, either either deleted partially or fully, or the full clitic is realized. Okay, so we're looking at essentially at 2 conditions. And we also coded the examples for whether the clitic conditioned lowering, raising, or no tonal changes at all. Okay, so we're asking the question, do reduced forms occur more often in contexts where the clitic conditions tonal changes on the root? And the answer is yes. So across the board, the reduced clitic, the one without the final vowel and the glottal stop, occurs pretty often, about 61% of the time, but it occurs significantly more often, the reduced form occurs significantly more often when that root happens to undergo tonal raising with that clitic. And it occurs a little bit more often, deletion or reduction occurs a little bit more often when the preceding root has tonal lowering. Okay. So why might deletion be more frequent when the root happens to undergo tonal raising than a pattern of tonal lowering? Well, one thing that I observed here, this is kind of a post hoc explanation, but tonal raising is the most restricted context. Raising only occurs on roots which carry tone 3. So in other words, if you hear a root that has a raised variant, you can be pretty confident as to the root's tonal identity. And you could be pretty confident that that means that a second person singular clitic is supposed to be there in the following syllable, and maybe it's deleted. Okay. But tonal lowering has varying conditioning factors, so it's a little bit more of a variable process. Is this tonal change in progress? Is this morphological change, tonal allophony or allomorphy? Well, an interesting observation is that in a related dialect, this process seems to have evolved even further. So there's just a final T clitic for the second person singular in the Chikawasta Triqui dialect. Okay, so the Triqui data suggest a relationship between the tonal information carried on the root and the degree of reduction in the clitic. And redundant segmental cues in the morphophonology then undergo reduction, and tonal cues that occur earlier in time persist. This is this notion of stability. So the tonal cues that are preceding the clitic, that are conditioned by the clitic, in fact, are those which are I'm sorry, I lost my place for a second. Sorry. The additional tonal cues persist, and those are the things that end up being stable. And I think that this is interesting because it suggests a diachronic pathway for the evolution of things like tonally conditioned allomorphy, where essentially allomorphs that are conditioned by different tonal contexts can occur and can evolve in human language. Okay, so to conclude, and to sort of back up from both studies, I hope that what I've shown is that even elaborate tonal systems in Mixtecan languages, Mixtec and Triqui, continue to undergo diachronic change. Sound change doesn't stop once a language has tones. And examining low-level synchronic variation alongside descriptive work on closely related varieties can help us elucidate the mechanisms for tonal change. And I think also, you know, I'm looking at two different methods here. One is experimental, one is documentation and corpus-based, and they end up really, I think, being useful here. So there's a lot of space for future research looking at variation in reduction at the sort of morphophonological interface, as well as the phonetics phonology interface. And the sort of last point, you know, even though we're looking at a complicated tonal system here, the usual suspects end up being causal. So speech reduction initiates tonal change, and gradual changes in cue weighting, you know, in relation to the raising context for the second person clitic. These things can lead to morphologically conditioned tonal allomorphy that could lead to tonal change. So these factors, I think phonologists and phoneticians are very familiar with: cue reweighting and speech reduction leading to patterns of sound change. And I think it's really not any that different in tonal languages. So I'd like to acknowledge support from the NSF, as well as a number of collaborators. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Thank you. Yes. So now we have some time for questions. Oops, just a second. By changing that screen, I couldn't see anymore my chat window. Just a second. Can you briefly come out of the full screen mode?
I did, and now I'm sharing. I thought I was sharing. Just, do people? You see my screen?
Yes,
you should press escape on your side.
You should stop sharing, maybe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, I should stop, or Seunghun?
Yeah, stop sharing.
You should stop.
Yeah.
I will stop sharing. I have stopped sharing.
Yes.
And,
so good. So now it's time for question. Well, it can be just question or clarification question, or like any question. And please, if you have any question, send a private message to Yoriko Ito with your name and your affiliation. Then you will do that. Since perhaps since people are still asking questions, like I will just give my liberty and see whether the other two presenters have any questions first. Andries or Shigeto. Yeah.
Go ahead, Andries.
Yeah. Oh,
you muted.
Yeah.
You're muted, Andries.
Now I'm unmuted, I believe, right? Okay, thank you. Fascinating stuff. And I was wondering as I was listening to it, these languages that you are looking at have rather complex tonal systems already.
Yes.
And are these changes complicating the tonal systems further, or are some of them kind of reductive changes that simplify the tonal systems? Because I have this feeling that there has to be a complexity pressure also that's going to, you know, not take a language already has 26 tonal melodies and explode it to now 50 tonal melodies. So what is it, complicating or simplifying the system?
It's a really interesting question. So I think in the case of Mixtec, to move to another level, it almost is. I've actually been really curious of whether or not this is neutralizing in the context of the rising tones. So I have a little bit of an intuition that if you were to play, find good minimal pairs and play them back to listeners, that it actually ends up being it's towards a pattern of neutralization. You can neutralize certain categories, so it's not always I think growing the tonal system. the patterns that I think the tonal change pattern, the patterns of tonal change in Otomangeian that ends up increasing the patterns, the number of tonal tones in the inventory, end up being those processes where you lose syllables. That ends up being the most common type of pattern that causes more elaboration. So you can, there's Chatino languages, for instance, some of them have disyllabic word structure and, you know, moderately sized tonal systems. And then some of the sister languages have lost a pretonic vowel. And as a result, you have now 14 tones rather than just 3 or 4 as a result of the loss of the vowel. And that's this idea of stability, right? So what were combinations of tones end up becoming single tones on a single syllable. And those are the patterns I think that increase the sizes of the inventories. You know, I don't think that the processes here necessarily involve extra complexity. Certainly not the morphophonology. So the morphophonological pattern in Triqui doesn't add an extra tone. It just eliminates, essentially causes a clitic to become more of just a tonal clitic. So.
Thank you.
So it seems like we have one question that just came in. Ito-san, can you just announce the person and then?
Okay, Miss Shalome Gordon from University of Pittsburgh for asking question.
Yeah, you will be.
Well, I assumed,
yes.
Yeah, I assumed you were going to read it, but hi, Christian. I just wanted to find out, in this documentation work that you're doing, have you noticed any sociolinguistic differences among the speakers that might be triggering or motivating some of these changes? And I'm thinking of this big picture of language change and thinking about some of the things that might motivate language change in general.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that. I think in relation to the Triqui data, women end up speaking more slowly than men do. Certainly in I have found in mixed sex interactions, and I actually have the intuition that women don't reduce the clitic as much as men do, but I haven't tested that, and so there I think are some of these pressures around who ends up speaking a sort of more standard form in the community and who's allowed to reduce, and so I think I've observed that. I haven't done a test on it though. For the Mistec thing, one thing I didn't say is that the speakers that had produced the rising tone as level in all contexts were all men, and none of the women did it. And so I think that there's, again, perhaps this notion of women speaking more carefully within the communities where I've worked, and that might end up being one of the factors that is possibly pertinent here.
Thanks.
Sure.
Anyone else who has a question? Yes.
So, well, it's a comment and a question, but so you're talking about some measure of recoverability of the clitic that's related to the deletion rate, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of effect is, like, you know, it's been extensively studied for English, but only in English, and it was really refreshing to see that in the language that's completely unrelated to English. I don't know any work that has done that beyond Indo-European languages. But on that note, I was curious if you have a way to quantify the degree of recoverability of that clitic. I think you're kind of mentioning that, but didn't really go into how you would quantify that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of hand-wavy explanation about what is, it's certainly the one context where we get, I mean, I think what would have to happen, and one thing I was even thinking about earlier today, is finding some way to establish the informational load that the adjacent tone is carrying, for indicating this clitic. And I think that, you know, it's not exactly an easy question because you're looking at morphology being sort of spread across the word via tonal morphology as well. But I think that, yeah, I think that would be the direction to go in, to sort of look at quantifying the sort of informativity of different, I mean, it's been done for phonological information load by work by Andy
Yeah.
Whittle. But in relation to sort of morphophonological load, I don't know. And that ends up being, you know, maybe the idea is to come up with a metric for evaluating morphophonological content.
Yeah, if I may, I find your example really encouraging because the effects that, Whittle and the colleagues are looking at, it's not clear whether they're looking at phonetic reduction or real phonological patterns.
Yeah.
They seem to want to say that that's shaping phonology, but it's not clear how.
Mm-hmm.
And your example may be really like, a knockdown argument that you can't really relegate that to phonetics. It's real in morphological patterns.
Yeah. Thank you.
Now, Young-do, now you can ask a question.
Hi. So following up the question about the sound change going toward a simpler or a complex direction, the Andries' first question, I wonder whether it actually involves the two different directions of the consideration. So at the one hand, the tonal changes itself is very complex, like a rising and then the lowering. But as you point out, really interesting thing is that the raising is happening only when the deletion is happening in the raising context, right? So only when the tone is totally predictable. So I wonder whether those tonal processes themselves are seemingly very complex, but actually when we look at this interaction at the morphophonological level, the predictability things I think is going on interacting with the tonal processes. So actually maybe some sort of the simplicity factor is there. I haven't like fully developed my thought, but I feel like there is some things to consider when, we consider this a simplicity issue.
So one thing that it is simplifying, if we want to think about, and I like your sort of idea that maybe it is simplifying in some ways. So the three clitics that induce tonal changes on roots are the first person singular, the second person singular, and the first person dual. Mm-hmm. So they are speech context participants. Mm-hmm. And for the first person singular and the first person dual, it's only on the root. The clitic is realized only on the root. And the second person singular is sort of halfway between I'm still a concatenative morpheme and I'm just tonal morphology on the root.
Right.
And so what might be simplifying is actually that class of clitics all to be just indicated on the root, so that you don't have any extra information. So maybe it's simplifying the clitic morphology in some ways, or making it parallel, making the clitics look similar in so far as they all are tonally marked for that class of clitics. But of course it makes other things more complicated. So yeah, but certainly the rules end up becoming more complicated. But
right.
Mm-hmm.